The maintenance bay of the galactic freighter Stellar Prowess looked like someone had dumped an entire planet's worth of grime into a metal box and called it a workspace. Chief Engineer Krixthal stood in the center of it all, his 4 crystalline eyes rotating independently as he surveyed the chaos with what could only be described as deep, existential regret. The kind of regret you feel when you realize that yes, you did volunteer for this assignment, and no, there's no one to blame but yourself. The filters, he announced to his engineering team, his translator struggling to convey the appropriate level of despair, have not been changed in approximately 4 cycles. 4 cycles, that was roughly 8 Earth months. 8 months of accumulated space dust, micro-debris, recycled air particulates, and what Krixthal suspected might be the remains of junior engineer Thep's lunch from 3 months ago. The filters were supposed to be changed monthly. Monthly. This was the kind of maintenance backlog that made experienced engineers question their life choices and consider careers in safer professions, like bomb disposal or professional volcano surfing. "Why?" asked junior engineer Thep, a young Valtorian whose scales still had that iridescent sheen of youth and optimism that life hadn't yet beaten out of him. "Why have they not been changed?" Krixthal fixed him with a look that could melt hull plating and probably violate several workplace harassment policies. "Because, junior engineer, the last 4 beings who attempted to access the filter compartment developed severe respiratory distress and had to be treated in medical bay. The compartment, as it turns out, has become a biological hazard zone that technically qualifies for its own gravitational field." "Oh," said Thep, his scales dulling slightly as the reality of the situation sank in with all the subtlety of a cargo container dropped from orbit. "That's unfortunate." "Unfortunate," repeated Krixthal, his voice dripping with the kind of sarcasm that could corrode durasteel and strip paint from bulkheads. "Yes, junior engineer, unfortunate, like a supernova is unfortunate, like a hull breach is unfortunate. Like hiring someone who thinks unfortunate adequately describes a compartment so toxic it qualifies as a war crime under 17 different galactic conventions, and possibly a few we haven't discovered yet." The maintenance bay doors hissed open with their characteristic pneumatic wheeze, interrupting what promised to be an excellent rant about workplace safety violations and the general incompetence of whoever designed a ship where the filters were this inaccessible. In walked the human, Emily Chen, carrying what appeared to be an entire hardware store's worth of cleaning supplies in various buckets, bags, and containers that clinked together with the sound of someone who had definitely raided the supply closet without filling out the proper requisition forms. She looked far too cheerful for someone about to confront 8 months of accumulated filth that had achieved what scientists would probably classify as sentience if they examined it closely enough. Her smile was the kind of smile that made Krixthal's threat assessment subroutines start firing warning signals. "Morning, Chief," she said brightly, setting down her supplies with a thud that echoed through the bay and probably registered on seismic sensors 3 decks down. "Heard you've got a filter situation that needs handling." Krixthal turned all 4 eyes on her simultaneously, which was his species' way of expressing either intense interest or intense incredulity. In this case, it was definitely the latter, with a generous helping of concern for her mental health and basic survival instincts. "You heard correctly, Human Chen. We have what the medical staff has termed a Class 4 contamination event. The filter compartment is considered off-limits to all personnel without hazmat certification, a profound disregard for their own well-being, and possibly a note from their therapist." "Great," Emily said with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for birthdays and lottery winnings, pulling out a respirator mask that looked like it had been designed for much less impressive tasks, like cleaning residential air ducts or maybe dusting bookshelves. "So, I'll just pop in there and swap them out. Should take a few hours." There was a moment of absolute silence in the maintenance bay. Even the ambient hum of the ship's systems seemed to pause in disbelief at what it had just heard. Somewhere in the distance, a tool fell to the floor with a clang that sounded like the universe's commentary on human decision-making. "Human Chen," Krixthal began, his voice taking on the carefully patient tone of someone explaining orbital mechanics to a particularly dim asteroid that had somehow gained consciousness and the ability to disappoint people. Perhaps you did not understand the gravity of the situation. The compartment is toxic, biologically hazardous, potentially lethal to several known species. The last engineer who entered required 3 days of respiratory treatment and now flinches whenever anyone mentions air quality. Emily shrugged, a gesture that Kriksthal had learned meant anything from agreement to complete disregard for one's own safety and the safety of everyone in a 50-meter radius. With humans, it was usually the latter. Yeah, but that was Grell talk, right? From the Methane Breathers Guild? Different biology, Chief. Different problems. Different respiratory systems. What's toxic to him might just be unpleasant to me. She pulled out what looked like a simple cloth mask, the kind humans wore during their primitive pandemic periods, when they still thought a piece of fabric would protect them from microscopic threats. Besides, I've cleaned worse. You should see what accumulates in a New York subway ventilation system. This is nothing. Absolutely nothing. This is a vacation compared to that nightmare. Nothing. She had called a Class 4 contamination event nothing. Kriksthal felt a headache forming in 3 of his 4 frontal lobes. The 4th lobe, responsible for long-term planning and risk assessment, had apparently given up entirely and decided to take an extended vacation somewhere tropical and far away from humans making terrible decisions. Very well, he said, because arguing with humans was like arguing with a black hole. Pointless, exhausting, and likely to end with you being pulled into something you'd rather avoid and probably shouldn't survive. Proceed at your own risk, Human Chen. I will prepare the medical bay for your inevitable admission and start drafting the incident report that will probably end my career. Emily laughed, which was another human sound that Kriksthal had learned to find simultaneously annoying and somewhat infectious, like a particularly cheerful disease. Thanks for the vote of confidence, Chief. Really feeling the support here. Hey, where are the Cubs? The Cubs. Of course she'd ask about the Cubs. The Stellar Prowess was one of the few freighters that allowed families aboard, which meant that several of the crew had brought their offspring. Currently, 3 young ones were playing in the corner of the maintenance bay, supposedly supervised but actually just running around creating chaos. Little Mirish, a Felixian cub with fur that changed colors based on her mood and was currently cycling through excited oranges and pinks. Tornak, a saurian hatchling who was mostly teeth and enthusiasm with very little brain matter in between. And Pip, an insectoid larva who communicated entirely through cheerful clicking sounds that the translation software struggled to interpret beyond general expressions of joy. They'd taken to following Emily around like cubs following someone who actually paid attention to them and didn't treat them like small, inconvenient versions of their parents who couldn't operate heavy machinery. They are in the observation area, Kriksthal said, gesturing with 2 of his forearms toward the reinforced viewing platform above the main bay, where they cannot interfere with critical operations or accidentally depressurize the ship or cause any of the other 57 documented ways that unsupervised cubs can cause catastrophic system failures. Mind if they watch? I promise I'll keep them safe and make it educational. Kriksthal cycled through several emotions, displayed beautifully through the chromatic shifts in his crystalline structure. Resignation, exhaustion, and a sort of bemused acceptance that his life had become a series of increasingly absurd situations involving humans and their bizarre decisions. If the Cubs wish to observe your probable demise, who am I to prevent them from learning valuable life lessons about workplace safety and the consequences of poor decision-making? Emily gave him a thumbs up, another gesture. That meant absolutely nothing to most species, and somehow meant everything to humans. Like they'd collectively decided that sticking 1 digit in the air would convey approval. You're the best, Chief. Best boss in the entire quadrant. She climbed up to the observation platform, where the 3 cubs immediately swarmed her like she was made of whatever species-appropriate treats they found most delicious. Mirish's fur cycled through happy yellows and pinks like a mobile mood ring. Tornak chirped excitedly, his tiny claws clicking on the metal flooring. Pip's clicking increased to what the translation software interpreted as friend, 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 on repeat, until Cricksthal muted that particular audio feed before it drove him to madness. "Okay, little ones," Emily said, kneeling down to their level despite the protest from her knees that had seen too many years of this kind of physical labor. "I'm about to do something really gross. Want to watch and learn?" 3 sets of eyes, eye stalks, and compound visual organs all fixed on her with the kind of undivided attention that would make any teacher weep with joy and probably question their career choices. "I'm going to clean the engine filters," Emily continued, pulling out her phone to show them pictures she'd downloaded from the ship's maintenance database that showed what clean filters should look like. "See all this yucky dust and dirt in the compartment? It's making the ship's air dirty and hard to breathe. When air's dirty, it makes people sneeze and feel bad and get headaches. So we're going to clean it up and make everyone feel better." Tornak chirped a question that the translator rendered as, "Sneeze bad? Hurt?" "Sneezing isn't bad exactly," Emily explained with the patience of someone who actually enjoyed teaching. "Very bad when it happens too much. Sneezing is your body's way of saying, hey, something's wrong with the air I'm breathing. So when you sneeze a lot, it means the air needs to be cleaned and fixed." She stood up and attached a safety harness to her belt, then clipped it to the platform railing with the kind of practiced efficiency that spoke of years doing dangerous work. "Now, the important thing is, when dust flies out, and trust me, there will be a lot of dust, you all need to cover your breathing holes. Can you do that for me?" 3 small heads nodded enthusiastically with the kind of vigorous agreement that only the young can muster. Cricksthal, watching from below with a growing certainty that he was about to witness either a miracle or a disaster that would require extensive paperwork, accessed the compartment controls and opened the outer seal with a command that he immediately regretted. The filter compartment door swung open with a hiss that sounded like the ship itself was sighing in relief. Or possibly warning them. Probably warning them and begging them to reconsider this entire endeavor. Emily peered inside, her headlamp cutting through the gloom to illuminate what could only be described as a monument to neglect and possibly a visual representation of what happened when maintenance schedules became suggestions rather than requirements. The filters, which should have been a pristine white according to manufacturer specifications, were so covered in accumulated grime that they'd taken on the appearance of ancient, cursed artifacts from a horror movie about archaeological disasters. "Oh, wow," Emily said, her voice muffled by her mask but still clearly audible. "Yeah, this is bad. This is really, really bad. This is possibly the worst I've seen outside of industrial sites that have been abandoned for decades." "Perhaps," Cricksthal called up, hope rising in his chest, "you would like to reconsider this course of action?" "Nah," Emily called back without hesitation. "I've started now. Besides, the Cubs are watching. Can't back down in front of the Cubs. That would teach them the wrong lesson about following through on commitments. Human logic." It defied every principle of rational decision-making and risk assessment that Cricksthal had learned in his 40 years of engineering experience. Emily climbed into the compartment, her tool belt clanking against the metal walls with sounds that echoed ominously through the maintenance bay. The Cubs pressed their faces, snouts, and various sensory apparatus against the viewing platform's transparent aluminum, watching with rapt attention, like this was the most entertaining thing they'd ever witnessed. The first filter came out with a sound like Velcro being ripped in slow motion if that Velcro was made of accumulated filth and broken dreams. A cloud of dust exploded outward like a small bomb had detonated, and Emily's silhouette disappeared into a gray-brown fog that looked like it had achieved sentience and was deeply offended at being disturbed after months of peaceful accumulation. On the observation platform, 3 small beings immediately started sneezing in perfect synchronization. Mirish let out tiny, kitten-like sneezes that were actually adorable, her fur cycling through colors so fast it looked like a malfunctioning rainbow generator having a nervous breakdown. Tornak's sneezes were more like small roars, each one accompanied by a tiny puff of flame that made Cricksthal's primary heart skip several beats and his secondary heart considered joining it in protest. Pip's sneezes came out as rapid-fire clicks that sounded like a tiny machine gun made of cute and confusion. "Cover your breathing holes," Emily called out from within the dust cloud, her voice echoing with determination. "Just like we practiced." The cubs complied, though their sneezing continued sporadically like biological metronomes marking time. Each time Emily pulled out another filter, another dust cloud would billow out like a small volcanic eruption, and the sneezing would start again with renewed vigor. It became a rhythm: pull, cloud, sneeze, 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 pull, cloud, sneeze, 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 over and over. "This," Crichthal muttered to himself while updating the incident log, "is the most ridiculous occupational hazard I have ever witnessed in my entire career." Junior Engineer Thep had appeared at his side, watching the spectacle with the kind of fascination usually reserved for watching binary stars collide or witnessing natural disasters from a safe distance. "Should we not intervene and stop this madness? And deprive the cubs of their educational experience?" Crichthal asked, his sarcasm reaching new heights of crystalline resonance that could probably be measured on scientific instruments. "Never let it be said that I interfered with the youth's learning opportunities about the consequences of poor planning and worse execution." Emily emerged from the compartment looking like she'd been dipped in gray paint and then rolled in a dust factory. Every exposed surface of her clothing, hair, and skin was covered in a fine layer of grime that would probably require industrial cleaning to remove. She pulled down her mask, revealing the only clean spot on her entire face, a pale oval surrounded by filth like a reverse mask. "Okay," she announced cheerfully, as if she hadn't just emerged from what looked like a disaster zone. "That's filters 1 through 6, only 12 more to go. We're making excellent progress." 12, repeated Crichthal faintly, his voice barely a whisper. "More. You said more." "Yep, this is going to take a while. Maybe grab some lunch." It did take a while, 3 hours and 47 minutes, to be precise. 3 hours and 47 minutes of Emily crawling in and out of the compartment, each time emerging looking more like a dust golem from ancient Earth mythology and less like a recognizable human being. 3 hours and 47 minutes of the cubs sneezing every single time a filter came out, their little bodies convulsing with the effort. 3 hours and 47 minutes of Crichthal contemplating whether this was how his career ended, watching a human turn his maintenance bay into a disaster zone, while 3 adorable children sneezed themselves into exhaustion and possible respiratory distress. But here was the thing that Crichthal noticed, and hated himself a little for noticing because it complicated his worldview. Emily kept checking on the cubs. Every single time she emerged with a filter, covered in substances that probably violated health codes in 17 systems, she'd look up at the observation platform and make sure they were okay. She'd remind them to cover their breathing holes. She'd make funny faces to make them laugh between sneezes. She'd ask if they needed water or if anyone needed a break. And the cubs, despite their continuous sneezing that would have sent most adults running for medical attention, were having the time of their lives. They'd started making a game of it, timing their sneezes to create what they probably thought was music, but what actually sounded like a small-scale respiratory apocalypse set to an unpredictable rhythm. When Emily finally emerged with the last filter, she looked less like a human and more like a mobile dust sculpture that had achieved consciousness through sheer determination. She set down the filter with the others, creating a pile of toxic waste that would require special disposal procedures and probably several environmental impact assessments before it could be safely jettisoned into space. "Done," she announced, peeling off her mask with visible effort. Her smile created cracks in the dust covering her face like a dried riverbed. "All 18 filters replaced. Air should be much better now. Give it about 30 minutes to cycle through." Crichthal ran a diagnostic from his console, his manipulators flying over the controls. The air quality readings were climbing rapidly, from the "technically we won't die immediately" range to the "this is actually pleasant to breathe" range. The improvement was so dramatic that Kriksthal thought his sensors might be malfunctioning. He ran the diagnostic 3 more times, each time getting the same impossible results. "Human Chen," he said slowly, processing the implications. "You have accomplished in 3 hours and 47 minutes what the engineering staff has been avoiding for 4 cycles." Emily shrugged again, that infuriating human gesture that conveyed everything and nothing. Sometimes you just gotta get in there and do the gross work. Nobody else was going to do it. Speaking of which, I need about 6 showers, maybe 7, possibly 8. She climbed up to the observation platform, where the cubs immediately mobbed her despite her current status as a walking biohazard that should probably be quarantined. Mirash rubbed against her legs, leaving fur stuck to dust, stuck to dirt in layers of filth. Tornak chirped happily, apparently completely unbothered by the clouds of particulates she was releasing with every movement. Pip clicked so enthusiastically that the translator gave up entirely and just displayed happy emojis in rapid succession. "You 3 were so brave," Emily told them, kneeling down despite the protest from her knees and back. "You kept your breathing holes covered and you were so good at watching and learning. High fives all around." She held up her hand, and each cub in turn touched it with their paw, claw, or manipulator appendage, creating a moment so disgustingly wholesome that Kriksthal felt something in his chest that might have been affection, or indigestion. Probably indigestion from the cafeteria food. "One question, Human Chen," Kriksthal called up. "Why did you allow the cubs to watch? Most beings would have sent them away, spared them the discomfort of the sneezing and exposure." Emily stood up, dust cascading off her like a particularly gritty waterfall. "Because they need to learn, Chief. They need to see that sometimes the important work is the gross work, the work that makes you dirty and uncomfortable and makes you question your life choices, the work that makes you sneeze and cough and want to give up." She looked down at the 3 cubs, who were still sneezing occasionally but looking incredibly proud of themselves for reasons that only made sense to young minds. They need to know that just because something is unpleasant doesn't mean it's not necessary. And they need to know that adults do this stuff not because we like it or enjoy being miserable, but because someone has to do it, and if we don't do it, everyone suffers with bad air. Also, she added, grinning through the dust, they're going to remember this day forever. The day the human cleaned the filters and they sneezed approximately 8,000 times. That's a good memory that will stick with them. Kriksthal considered this with all 4 of his frontal lobes now engaged. In his species, cubs were shielded from unpleasant work until they reached maturity and could handle such things emotionally. Protected, kept away from anything that might be uncomfortable or distressing or challenging. He'd always thought this was the superior approach, the civilized way to raise functional adults. But watching the 3 cubs now, covered in dust, still sneezing occasionally, but absolutely delighted with themselves and what they'd witnessed, he wondered if perhaps humans understood something about raising young ones that the rest of the galaxy had missed in their pursuit of comfort and protection. "Medical bay is still available," he said, "should you require respiratory treatment for yourself or the cubs." Emily laughed, that annoying, infectious sound that somehow made the maintenance bay feel less oppressive. "I'm good, Chief. Just need those showers and maybe some industrial-strength soap. And maybe someone should check on the cubs anyway. Make sure they're not developing any sensitivity reactions to all that dust they breathed." "Already scheduled," Kriksthal said, because he wasn't incompetent, no matter what the staffing report said about his management style. "Medical Officer Gentara is expecting them within the hour for routine respiratory assessments." "Perfect." Emily started to leave, then paused at the doorway. "Hey, Chief. Thanks for letting me do this. I know it was risky and probably violated several safety protocols, but sometimes risks pay off and someone just needs to do the difficult thing." She left, trailing dust and probably violating several cleanliness protocols that would require someone to clean the corridors she walked through. The cubs followed her to the door, then returned to the observation platform to look at the pile of removed filters with the kind of reverence usually reserved for historical artifacts or religious relics. Junior engineer Thep appeared at Crichthal's side again, still processing what they'd witnessed. That was extraordinary. Unprecedented even. That was reckless endangerment of multiple beings, including minors, Crichthal corrected. But his tone lacked conviction, and he knew it. The air quality has improved by 63% already, Thep observed, pulling up the data. Crew reports are already noting the difference. Several beings are commenting that they can breathe more easily and didn't even realize they'd been having difficulty breathing until now, when suddenly they're not. Crichthal pulled up the reports on his primary console. Thep was right. Already, crew members throughout the ship were noting improvements in their status updates. Less fatigue, fewer headaches, better sleep cycles, improved concentration. All because one human had been willing to crawl into a toxic compartment and do the job that everyone else, including himself, had been avoiding for 4 cycles. Log this in the maintenance records, Crichthal instructed, making the decision. Full commendation for Human Chen. Hazard pay bonus, and schedule regular filter changes moving forward, monthly, no exceptions. I want someone assigned specifically to this task with proper training and equipment. Will anyone volunteer after seeing Human Chen emerge looking like a sentient dust cloud that achieved consciousness? Thep asked reasonably. Crichthal thought about this for several moments. Offer significant hazard pay. Very significant. And maybe we should implement what Human Chen did. Train some of the younger engineers. Show them that this kind of work, while unpleasant and dirty, is necessary and valuable to ship operations and crew health. Like how Human Chen let the cubs watch and learn. Exactly like that, Crichthal admitted, surprising himself, though preferably with fewer sneezes and better protective equipment for all involved parties. 3 decks away, in the communal showers that the human had commandeered for what she called a deep clean and what probably qualified as a decontamination procedure, Emily Chen stood under hot water and watched months of accumulated filth swirl down the drain in patterns that would probably fascinate scientists. Her lungs felt surprisingly clear, her breathing easy and unrestricted. The respirator had worked perfectly, just as she'd known it would from experience. She thought about the cubs, their wide eyes watching her work, their brave little sneezes every time dust flew out of that compartment. She thought about what they'd learned today, that sometimes adults do hard, unpleasant things, not because they want to, but because those things need doing and someone has to step up. That getting dirty isn't the end of the world, and sometimes it's necessary for the greater good. That a little sneezing now prevents a lot of breathing problems later for everyone on the ship. Tomorrow, little Mirish would probably tell her parents all about the human who cleaned the filters and emerged looking like a monster made of dust. Tornak would breathe easier in the improved air and not even realize why his training runs felt easier and why he had more energy. Pip would click happily in air that wouldn't irritate his developing respiratory spiracles and allow him to grow properly. And somewhere in those young minds, a seed would be planted. The understanding that maintenance matters even when it's unglamorous, that difficult work has value even when it's unpleasant, that someone has to clean the filters even when the filters make you sneeze and question every life decision that led to that moment. Emily smiled, soap and water finally returning her face to its normal human coloration instead of the gray mask. Yeah, this had been a good day, a productive day, a day that made a difference, even if she'd probably be coughing up dust for the next week and finding grime in places she didn't know grime could reach. In the maintenance bay, Crichthal stood alone, all 4 eyes fixed on the diagnostic readouts, showing steadily improving air quality throughout every deck of the ship. The stellar prowess was breathing easier. Its crew would breathe easier. Their health would improve. And 3 young cubs had learned a valuable lesson about the importance of doing the hard, necessary work that nobody else wants to do. All because one human had been willing to get dirty and make some kids sneeze and risk her own health for the good of everyone else on board. Humans, Crichthal muttered to himself, shaking his head in that universal gesture of bemused acceptance. But he was smiling, at least in the way his species smiled, which mostly involved his crystalline structure refracting light in slightly different patterns that indicated contentment. Somewhere in the observation area, 3 cubs were still sneezing occasionally, telling each other increasingly elaborate stories about the brave human who fought the dust monsters that lived in the filter compartment and won through determination and proper safety equipment. The filters were clean, the air was pure, and the galaxy was just a little bit better for having people like Emily Chen in it, even if everyone's noses were still a bit irritated from all that sneezing.